in any case, got to be unexpected. So very much like the surprise bit from the old definition. The second thing, non-routine. So there are emergencies, there are always problems. You know, there are people will hurt themselves, you know, blah blah blah. But a crisis has to be non-routine. So it's like an emergency sort of kicked up a notch. And so basically what it says, crises are events that cannot be managed by routine procedures. Instead, crises require unique and often extreme measures. So it's not some sort of routine something, although a lot of things are routine these days. Like terrorism is becoming routine. It's horrible. But this is sort of huge. You know, it's not just your regular run-of-the-mill. You know, somebody, a car wreck is not, it's terrible, but it's not a crisis, right? It's fairly routine. In any case, the next produces uncertainty. We don't know what to do. We don't know what's going to happen. Because it's outside of the routine. So we have no idea. So basically what it says here, again, Table 1.1, organizations cannot be aware of all causes and ultimate effects of crisis without some degree of an investigation. Efforts to reduce uncertainty may continue for months or even years after the crisis. So it's like, we don't know why this happened. We don't know all the outcomes. We don't know what all the effects are going to be. So, we don't know. So that is the third component here of our new expanded definition of crisis. The next thing, and this goes back to their dangerous opportunity, is to be a crisis, it creates opportunity. And the way they say this, because it says it offers us a new way of looking at things that perhaps we never looked at things that way in our normal routine situations. So crises create opportunities to learn, make strategic changes, grow, or develop new competitive advantages. So it creates opportunities. And then finally, the last component of our working definition of organizational crisis, the new one, is it's got to be a threat to image, reputation, or high priority goals. So it says it's an intense level of threat to the organization and its affiliates. So it says crisis can also be threatening enough to permanently destroy an organization and to kill lots of birds. So again, these are, if the initial sort of history or old school thing was just sort of, surprise, threat, and short response time, their new expanded definition for something to be a crisis, it's unexpected, it's non-routine, produces uncertainty, but creates opportunities, but it's got to be sort of a huge threat to the image, reputation, or high priority goals of a particular organization. And it could kill people and little seagulls. Got it? Good. Then they move on, and the next section of the chapter, and therefore the next little slide on that you can't see again, is the stuff on crisis is different from other things. There's my Millennium Falcon. That's different from other spaceships. A crisis is different from other things. So basically it says a disaster ain't a crisis. It could be, I suppose, but it's different from a crisis. So disaster, not a crisis. Which, again, I don't know why it's not. So similarly, on a much smaller scale compared to crises and disasters, those are emergencies. So you can experience disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes, but I guess those are not necessarily sort of a crisis. You know, a tornado can go and kill a bunch of people in a mobile home park someplace in Oklahoma, but it's not really a crisis. It's a disaster. Also, a crisis is not an emergency. That doesn't make sense. I mean, I think they're thinking from an organizational point of view. There's a big difference between a tornado killing a few folks and a tornado sort of completely and utterly, destroying a elementary school and several children killed. Is different. And it's not a routine emergency. So emergencies, that ain't a crisis either. So people have emergencies all the time. And this is why I was sort of trying to, this gets sort of complicated. It says, if you have to evacuate a building due to a gas leak, that's an emergency. So you got to handle it. Okay. That's not what they're talking about in this book. They say, conversely, a gas explosion at an organization is a crisis. So every once in a while, we'll have, little emergencies. The fire alarms might go off in Cottingham Theater. That's an emergency. Even if you see a little smoke someplace, it's not a crisis. A crisis would be Cottingham burned down. God, wouldn't that be awesome? No, I'm joking. But in any case, and then there's a disaster is disaster. It's not necessarily a crisis. Emergency is emergency, but it's not necessarily a crisis. And then they also move on to talking about the difference between crisis and risk. And they say on the bottom of page 9, we separate crisis and risk because we believe that while risk is a natural part of life, I suppose, and one of my favorite games, crisis can often be avoided. Naturally, and I don't agree with some of this stuff, naturally some people live with more risk in their lives than others. For example, some people choose to live next to oil refineries. Maybe. Or maybe they can't afford to live anywhere else. Or hurricane-prone coast. Yeah. Or an area susceptible to mudslides or forest fires. Please understand, however, that crisis and risk are closely connected, blah, 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 blah. So, but their risk is sort of doing stupid stuff that might, lead to stuff. But again, a lot of people, think about Cancer Alley in Louisiana. There's so many people who live close to plants and stuff like that because that's all they can afford. It's not a choice. Crazy. But in any case, so again, they're trying to define what a crisis is, and they have those key components, and then they say, disasters are disasters, but not crisis, emergency, emergency, but not crisis, and crisis and risk communication are different, or crises and risks are different. So hopefully you get that. The next slide, and thus the next part of chapter 1, is when they move into types of crises, now that we've established some of the definitional terrain of what a crisis is. And there are generally 2 types of crises: intentional ones and unintentional ones. Even though I think some of the unintentional probably are intentional or out of neglect. Here are the lists of intentional crises. And again, my next slide. Terrorism, and they talk about that. I'll let you read that. Sabotage, if you don't know what sabotage is. And it's more than a Beastie Boys song. It involves intentional damaging of a product or the working capacity of the organization by someone inside the organization. Another type of intentional crisis is workplace violence. They talked about former employees going postal, particularly at post offices. Poor employee relationships, which I think is pretty important. What the book says, if an organization cannot develop positive relationships between management and its workers, trouble is likely to occur. For example, an organization could develop a reputation of having poor working conditions, there can be big strikes, blah, 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 blah. You think of University of Missouri, or lots of other colleges that aren't dealing with issues of diversity as they should. Poor risk management, they say, is another type of intentional crisis, and they talk a little bit about that. They talk about, for example, a beef processing plant in a Midwestern city failed to adequately maintain its sewer system, creating a dangerous public health hazard. And again, there are some folks who talk about how the flooding in Columbia was in part due to some neglect of some of the dams. There was a story about that in the state a while back. So poor risk management, hostile takeovers, and that you can read about what that is, but basically, people take control of another organization through stocks and everything like that. And then the final sort of intentional crisis is unethical leadership, and it talked about the Institute for Crisis Management and how this is an extensive review of more than 6,000 newsworthy organizational crisis events reported annually by the Institute for Crisis Management, or ICM, found that management was in some way responsible for the majority of them. Worse, many of these crises were caused by criminal acts of managers. So there's just a lot of bad people out there, and they can create a crisis. So again, the intentional types of crises that they discuss here: terrorism, sabotage, workplace violence, poor employee relationships, poor risk management, hostile takeovers, and unethical leadership. And by the way, I have put a new bookmark on KC. That is the most recent report I could find. It was 2014 from the Institute for Crisis Management, or ICM. And I happen to have it with me. Ah, the book fell. Is that a crisis? This is what it looks like. It would be really cool if you read this. And it's really, really interesting. I read through this pretty quickly. It basically said there were 223,000 crisis news stories in nearly 10,000 news outlets last year, and this is 2014. And it has a list of all these different things, and they have cool charts and graphs. Look at that. Isn't that cool? The majority of the crises was mismanagement. Go figure. 33.47%. Labor disputes were only 3%. Hostile takeovers, only about 3%. Executive dismissals, a little bit over 5%. Discrimination, only 4%. Defects and recalls, only 3%. Cyber crime, only about 4%. Consumer activism, only about 4%. Environmental damage, only about 6%. Casualty accidents, only about 7%, about 6%. There's an other of 5%. White collar crime, about 14%. Whistleblowers, about 7%. Mismanagement was the biggest. And then it talks about the most crisis-prone industries. In 2014, the transportation industry, automobile manufacturing, banking and financial services, food, pharmaceuticals, education, energy, retail, defense and aerospace, and then finally, healthcare. And that's really interesting. So I would take a look at this. It goes through all these different types of crises that happened, how many natural disasters there's been, all this type of stuff. So it's really good information. It really sort of helps you understand what this is all about. And There are only 2 workshops left in 2014. Oops, I missed them.